It's exactly as expected, he sneered, adjusting the control panel on his forearm. Barren, blistering, and begging to be conquered. The sand shifted beneath as waves of alien transport ships descended to establish the initial base, sending cascades of dust into the scorching air. Elite soldiers, clad in dark armor designed for dense jungles and lush planetary settings, stepped onto the ground, shaking their heads at the absurdity of invading such a desolate region. They prepared for hostile resistance, but what could these humans possibly do in a desert so unforgiving, even to its own kind? Scans show zero indigenous presence for miles, reported Lieutenant Uris, tapping her glass screen as the data filtered through. Pitiful, Zrath replied, waving off the information. These humans have avoided this wasteland for good reason. Too weak to survive here, no doubt. Zratha's fingers trailed across the metallic railing as he watched his soldiers march in perfect formations across the desert sands. In their minds, the invasion of Earth's deserts was merely a formality, a place to establish a foothold before advancing on populated areas. Even if humans were rumored to be resilient, surely no real force could survive out here. After all, deserts had conquered many civilizations without lifting a finger. Yet, far from their sensors and unseen beneath the heat-miraged horizon, a team of human soldiers waited, blending seamlessly with the shifting dunes. Lieutenant Ryan Carter crouched low in the sand, sand-cloaked and ready, his sharp eyes tracking the alien convoy's every move. He knew these desert sands like the back of his hand. To Carter, the desert wasn't empty, it was alive, unpredictable, but navigable if you respected it. Beside him, his team of elite operatives lay hidden, cloaked in desert camo and hidden beneath layers of fabric that kept them cool under the relentless sun. Looks like they took the bait, Carter whispered into his comm. His voice was almost lost to the wind, but the message was clear. They think we're miles from here, probably sitting in air-conditioned bases. Private Ramirez snickered softly. That's the problem with these guys. Too much tech, not enough common sense. Focus, Carter reminded his team. We've got one shot to catch them off guard. Meanwhile, back at the alien command base, Zratha's confidence grew. Scans continued to reveal nothing but endless stretches of sand. Yet, just as he turned to enter his command tent, an unfamiliar shimmer on the edge of his vision caught his attention. He squinted, convinced it was nothing more than a trick of the heat. Deploying additional ground units, he ordered anyway, irritated by the phantom movements that seemed to dance just out of reach. His pride wouldn't allow the possibility of error, but something unsettling twisted in his gut. He brushed it aside. After all, he was leading the most advanced force his people had ever assembled. Who or what could stand in their way? At that moment, Carter's team struck. A shot rang out, precise and unforgiving, and one of Zratha's soldiers dropped to the sand. The ground units scrambled, firing into the emptiness around them, but they couldn't see the human operatives who seemed to vanish as quickly as they'd appeared. In the cover of confusion, Carter's team advanced, using the dunes and mirages as shields, each member moving with the desert's rhythm. Surround them, Zrath barked, frustration biting at the edge of his voice. We are not to be embarrassed by these primitive sand crawlers. But Carter knew these sands as no alien could. With each strike, his team pulled back, drawing the aliens farther from their base, deeper into the harshest part of the desert. The alien forces, already beginning to sweat under the punishing heat, were weighed down by their heavy, heat-trapping armor. Zratha's face tightened, the ease of their mission evaporating under the relentless sun and unseen enemy. Lieutenant Uris glanced at Zrath, her own confidence shaken. Perhaps we should reevaluate our approach, Commander. Withdraw in the face of humans? Zrath spat, the veins in his neck pulsing as he barked the order to press on. He was determined to crush these humans, even as the desert itself seemed to turn against his forces. The heat increased, radiating off the sands and shimmering up around them, blurring vision and forcing even Zratha's hardened soldiers to falter. Unseen, Carter's team continued to guide their movements with calculated precision, luring the aliens into a maze of shifting dunes. The desert had become more than a battleground, it was a weapon. As Zrath's forces stumbled and repositioned under the weight of the glaring sun, Carter smiled. He knew they had underestimated not just the desert, but those who had mastered it. And as the sandstorm began to gather on the horizon, Carter signaled to his team, preparing for the next phase. A sudden gust of hot wind swept across the desert, sending tendrils of sand curling through the air like ghostly figures. Carter crouched low behind a dune, peering through the haze as the alien soldiers regrouped in the open, still unable to locate their unseen assailants. Every instinct told him that this was the moment to press, and his team, reading his silence as intent, adjusted their positions in synchrony. "Carter, their tech is still scrambling for us, but they're digging in." Ramirez's voice crackled softly over the comms, laden with anticipation. "Good. Let them get comfortable," Carter replied, his voice laced with the quiet confidence of a man who knew the land and its deadly secrets. He watched the aliens' clumsy maneuvers, noting how their thick, dark armor absorbed the heat mercilessly, leaving many soldiers visibly struggling as the sun bore down. The alien commander, Zrath, if the intercepted transmissions were right, was still pressing forward, forcing his troops deeper into the hostile terrain with what Carter could only call arrogance. Carter smiled grimly, knowing that pride had brought down more than one enemy in these sands. The first strike came swift and sharp, a flash of movement as Specialist Lee dropped low, rifle steady, and released a silent bullet that tore through the ranks. An alien soldier went down, his armor failing to protect him from the unseen attacker. Confusion erupted within the alien camp as they scrambled to identify the source, their eyes scanning a barren, silent landscape that seemed to play tricks on them. Zrath's voice cut through the confusion, barking orders. "Form a perimeter! Stop firing blindly! Conserve your energy!" He glared at the dunes, anger simmering beneath his rigid expression as another one of his men fell. He might have been arrogant, but he was no fool. He could feel the invisible grip of the desert tightening around them, the environment itself betraying them at every turn. From their vantage point, Carter and his team continued to strike with surgical precision, each shot a calculated step in a deadly dance. They moved like shadows, blending into the sand, retreating when the aliens attempted to advance, and reappearing on another side to strike again. Sandstorms swept in, adding chaos to the battleground as swirling grains of sand stung the aliens' skin, scratched against their lenses, and disoriented their senses. "They're falling apart, sir," Sergeant Quinn murmured, her voice low and unwavering. Her gaze, sharp as an eagle's, followed every move the aliens made, predicting their steps, seeing their mounting fear. "Then let's turn up the heat," Carter replied. He activated the next phase of their plan, signaling his team to form a wide arc around the alien force. His command unleashed a precise volley of gunfire that echoed across the dunes, each shot carefully spaced to simulate a larger force. To Zrath and his troops, it was an ambush from all sides, and they had no choice but to turn defensive, huddling together in a tight formation. "This heat, it's impossible," Lieutenant Uris muttered, her voice hoarse as she struggled to catch her breath. Sweat streaked her face, her armor trapping the blistering temperature inside, making it feel as though she was burning from within. "It's a planet of savages and dust," Zrath snapped, yet even he was squinting through the heat haze, his confidence visibly faltering as he noted his soldiers' deteriorating condition. The terrain was warping before his eyes, shimmering with the energy of relentless sunlight and sand. Meanwhile, Carter's team, cloaked in light, heat-reflective desert gear, remained cool and deliberate. They timed their shots to the rhythm of the rising winds, using the natural cacophony to mask their movements. The desert wasn't their enemy. It was an ally, bending to their will, its sandstorms and shadows veiling them from sight. A sudden, fierce gust tore across the field, and Carter signaled a temporary halt. His team held back, letting the elements play their part, watching as the alien soldiers squinted into the distance, searching desperately for their invisible attackers. The storm hit hard, grains of sand pelting the aliens like thousands of tiny projectiles. Zrath and his remaining troops scrambled, locking their helmets down and trying to shield themselves from the biting onslaught. But the sand, fine and insidious, slipped through every crevice, clogging joints and blinding optics. The soldiers' movements grew slow, sluggish, trapped in armor that was as much a hindrance as a defense. "No," Carter murmured, his voice barely a whisper, but his team moved like an unleashed force. They surged forward, capitalizing on the aliens' helplessness, pushing their advance with a silent ferocity that turned every inch of the desert into hostile ground. Alien soldiers fell as Carter's team struck with precision, exploiting every vulnerability. Srath, furious and exhausted, attempted to rally his troops, but each call went unanswered as his soldiers staggered, beaten down by both the human onslaught and the desert itself. Finally, as the storm began to ease, Carter signaled a retreat, pulling his team back to their hidden positions. They had made their point clear: the desert was no ally to invaders. The humans were here, and they were prepared to fight to the last grain of sand. As Carter watched Srath's defeated forces regroup, battered and humbled, he knew the battle was far from over. And with another storm brewing on the horizon, he could only smile grimly, the promise of what lay ahead heavy in the desert air. Srath's rage simmered as he scanned the bleak dunes, now a graveyard of alien technology. The once polished armor of his elite force lay dulled and sand-scarred, the relentless desert stripping them of the advantages they'd once wielded. His pride clashed with the sinking realization that these humans knew the sands intimately, making the land itself an enemy. This battleground, which he had deemed insignificant, was shifting against him. "Status report!" Srath barked, his voice a sharp crack that echoed through his depleted ranks. "Resources and morale are critically low, sir," Lieutenant Yuris admitted, her own voice barely concealing exhaustion. The troops looked on with hollow, sweat-streaked faces. She hesitated. "They're losing hope." Srath's fists clenched as he swallowed his frustration. Never had he faced an enemy so adept at using terrain to their advantage. He'd heard of humans' resilience, their tenacity, but he had dismissed it as myth, a primitive species' attempt to inflate their reputation. Now, standing amid the dunes with an army reduced to a scattering of weary survivors, he questioned his assumptions. Meanwhile, from their concealed position, Carter's team observed the disarray. Every alien movement broadcast their frustration, their desperation. They were faltering, one misstep from collapse. Sergeant Quinn lay beside Carter, her gaze sharp and ready. "Think they'll pull out?" she asked, her voice a low murmur. "Not Srath," Carter replied. "His pride will keep him here. But that pride is our weapon now." He signaled his team, and they spread out across the dunes, moving silently under the cover of dusk. The desert was darkening, its shifting sands now their ally in ways the alien technology couldn't anticipate. With Srath still gripping the reins, the aliens would be drawn deeper into the death trap Carter and his team had set. As night fell, Carter outlined the next phase of their plan. "Tonight we move fast and hit harder," he said. "They're exhausted, unfamiliar with the terrain, and their tech can't save them from this darkness. They think they're facing a small guerrilla force, but we're going to make them believe they're surrounded." The team nodded, energized by the clarity of their leader's voice and the strategic brilliance behind his words. While the aliens huddled in defensive formations, hoping to endure the punishing conditions, Carter's team moved through the shadows, igniting brief flashes of fire to disrupt the alien camp and adding to their fear of an invisible, inescapable enemy. "Enemy spotted at 2 o'clock!" Quinn called softly over the comms, her rifle aimed, her silhouette barely visible against the dunes. In a heartbeat, the team struck, swift and deadly, their bullets slicing through the air and sending the aliens scrambling. Srath was livid. His troops were tripping over themselves, scattering under fire they couldn't pinpoint. He called out to his soldiers, but their discipline was cracking, their fear evident. This desert was a labyrinth, and every grain of sand seemed to work in the humans' favor. Srath could no longer deny that they had underestimated not just the terrain, but the adaptability of these human warriors. The team's onslaught was relentless. Ramirez set traps beneath the sand, knowing exactly where the aliens would step, each explosion kicking up thick clouds of dust that disoriented their already desperate foes. Carter moved like a phantom, his rifle silent, his targets falling without a sound. Every strike was calculated, every blow designed to amplify the chaos. By the dead of night, the alien force was a fractured remnant of what it had been. Srath, surrounded by his scattered soldiers, began to feel the weight of his defeat looming. The humans had shown no mercy, no relent. His elite army had been reduced to desperate survivors, barely holding on to the semblance of order. And here, in the deadliest of Earth's deserts, there was no escape. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Srath signaled to Lieutenant Uris, his hardened voice tinged with something she'd never heard before, doubt. "This is more than we anticipated," he admitted. "But we'll not retreat." "We may not have a choice, Commander," Uris replied, her voice betraying the exhaustion and hopelessness spreading among the ranks. She glanced at the dwindling supplies, the malfunctioning tech, and the faces of her fellow soldiers, each bearing the marks of endless sand and relentless battle. She had fought at his side for countless campaigns, but this was different. This was unwinnable. Yet Sratha's pride wouldn't yield, even in the face of a tactical disaster. "Prepare to fight until the end. These humans want to play with shadows and sand? Then let's show them our strength." But deep in his heart, Srath knew it was a lie. The desert had claimed his soldiers, and Carter's team, those relentless, invisible ghosts, were exploiting every weakness. His army, once the pride of his empire, had been humbled, laid bare in a hostile world they had thought simple and primitive. Back at his position, Carter watched as Sratha's forces staggered into a last, desperate formation. A sense of grim satisfaction washed over him, yet he kept his gaze fixed. The fight wasn't over, but victory was in sight. The desert had worn down their enemy's resolve, and now, Carter and his team only needed to land the final blow. As the stars shimmered above the cooling dunes, Carter signaled his team, his voice steady and resolute. "Tomorrow, we finish this." The first light of dawn cast a pale glow over the dunes, illuminating the remnants of a battlefield claimed by Earth's relentless desert. Sratha's forces, once an elite alien brigade, were now huddled together, their ranks decimated and their armor battered by the unforgiving sands. What remained of the once mighty army bore the exhaustion and fear of those pushed to their limits. Srath glanced over his troops, his pride and fury dulled by the harsh reality settling in. Around him, the soldiers who had survived the night avoided his gaze, their faces marked by sleepless nights and the oppressive, unyielding heat. His mind churned, realizing that retreat might be his only option, though it felt like swallowing glass. "Sir?" Lieutenant Uris began, her voice cracked and barely a whisper. Her usual sharp posture was gone, her shoulders slumped as she glanced uneasily at him. "We're critically low on resources. Many of our men, they're too weak to continue. This desert is—" She hesitated, struggling with the words. "It's killing us." Srath felt the weight of her words, the truth in them pressing on him like the oppressive desert sun. But more than that, he felt the humiliation of being bested not by superior firepower or technological might, but by this barren world and the humans who wielded it with the expertise of lifelong soldiers. The sight of those few men remaining, faces hidden beneath dust, armor heavy with failure, clawed at him. Still, surrender was anathema. "We don't retreat from primitives," he growled, even though a hollow doubt lingered beneath his defiant words. On the distant ridge, Carter watched the crumbling remnants of the alien force. He could see the indecision in their leader's movements, the limp resignation of the soldiers gathered around him. Carter knew they were broken. The desert had done its work, and his team's tactics had pushed Sratha's forces to the edge. "Looks like they're about done, sir," Quinn muttered beside him, her face painted with exhaustion but her eyes sharp and focused. Carter nodded, though his expression was thoughtful. "They could have left at any time, but their pride kept them here." He paused, looking out over the barren field strewn with the broken remains of Sratha's soldiers. "That pride is a powerful weapon, but it's a double-edged one." "Orders?" Ramirez asked, his tone respectful, though he clearly sensed the victory within reach. "We're holding fire," Carter replied, surprising his team. He tapped his earpiece, broadcasting on a frequency he knew Srath would pick up. "Commander Srath, this is Lieutenant Carter. I advise you to pull back your forces." There's no point in further bloodshed. For a long moment, only silence answered. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Zratha's voice crackled over the comms, strained and bitter. You expect me to bow to your mercy, human? This desert demands respect. Carter answered, his tone even. You underestimated it and us. But I'm offering you a way out. Zratha's anger flared, his pride bristling at the words. But behind him, his soldiers were too weak to continue. Many were wounded, and even those who could stand had lost their will to fight. His lieutenant Euris stepped closer, her expression pleading. Commander, we must think of our people. We've lost too much here. Zrath clenched his fists, his pride clashing with the truth of their defeat. Finally, with a heavy exhale, he nodded, his voice quiet. Withdraw. We're leaving. The alien soldiers, stunned but grateful, began their retreat, stumbling through the desert as they prepared to abandon their failed conquest. Zratha's defiance remained, yet he felt a gnawing respect for these humans who had bested him not with force, but with understanding, a weapon more potent than he had foreseen. Carter watched as the alien forces departed, knowing this retreat was more than a tactical win. It was a testament to human resilience and adaptability. Turning to his team, he gave a nod. We're done here. Good work, everyone. As they began their own quiet retreat, a silence settled over the desert. The dunes reclaimed the evidence of battle, shifting gently under the dawn light, as though no one had ever disturbed their peace. Carter paused at the edge of the battlefield, glancing back one last time at the empty desert. The aliens had been outmatched not by superior weapons or numbers, but by the quiet, relentless power of Earth itself. Back at the command base, as Carter debriefed with his superiors, he reflected on the battle's deeper significance. This victory wasn't just a triumph over alien invaders, it was a revelation. Earth's most inhospitable places, once viewed as weaknesses, could be their strongest defenses. And as Carter left the briefing room, he felt certain of one thing: any future threats would be met with the same unyielding spirit that had protected these deserts for eons.